Yeah, good morning all. Thank you for showing up at 10 a.m. on a Friday morning. I'm pleasantly surprised that I don't know half of the audience. My name is Shane. The Patrick there in the middle is purely and simply for academic credibility. And yeah, my talk this morning, I will hover vaguely close to the laptop to remind myself what I'm supposed to talk about, and I'll do my best to keep it not too rambling so I can get some questions, comments, or mini presentations disguised as questions at the end. So the whole concept of cyborgs is a bit of the term itself is debated at times, but I'm going to go to a very simplistic version. It's cybernetic organism is where the term itself comes from. Klein in 1960 came up with the general modern sort of interpretation of it from sci-fi and also medical and legal backgrounds. They were actually thinking about the idea of augmenting human bodies with biomechanical technology for travel in space. So the key idea that I'm going to deal with is perhaps to some a narrow view of what cyborg might mean, but it's essentially biomechanical augmentation of human bodies and how that might impact mainly law. My background is in law, so that's probably the area I'm most comfortable with, but also more broadly society and socio-legal norms. So the first clip that I'm going to go to is actually a clip from the video game Deus Ex: Human Revolution, because I find it a pretty handy starting point. It's one of the places which I looked at and went, right, this is nice that you can take something that's media, that's publicly halfway understandable, and say, right, there are actually interesting legal questions in all of these areas.
Haven't you lost enough people today?
I'm sorry.
We're seconds away. His body can take it. Miraculous. I think we got it, Doctor. Give him the info link. Give me the telecom package.
I was just saying earlier, I had forgotten how much fun it was going to be to play that clip on a massive cinema screen, so that was one of the highlights of me giving this talk. I've given versions of it before. But there are a few interesting comments, I don't know if you heard them, in that where someone, a disembodied voice, says his body can take it. That happens to be Adam Jensen, the protagonist of the game's boss. So that's an interesting question for various different reasons: employment law, consent, medical law, professional medical negligence, that his boss seems to have had a very interesting contract which allowed him to say, it's fine, hack all his limbs off, we're going to replace them with biomechanical augmentations. The other one was near the end, it said, get me the telecom package. And that brings in a whole bunch of issues which I'll touch on later on about data protection and data either flowing into the human body or out of the human body. So things like this, the video game Deus Ex itself is a handy intro to a lot of the sort of legal and sociological, ethical problems which you'll find in this area. So one of the things I thought when I watched this was that Adam Jensen definitely needs a better lawyer, and or the future that's projected in this context is quite a weird one, where you wouldn't really get away with an employment contract along those lines. But Ryan Davidson has looked into this, and he's done a quite interesting analysis from American employment law perspective as to how this would come about, how a contract like that would work, called cybernetics contracts and specific performance. But it got me thinking, because my background was more in medical negligence, professional medical negligence law, and I thought, how would that work with medical law as it is now? And there's something that's used in the UK and Ireland called the General Approved Practice, the GAP, which is the standards of the profession. So it'd be interesting to watch as these things become more ubiquitous, as they become better, as they function better. At what point does it become, first of all, generally accepted that if someone has had a very bad injury to their arm, that you cut that arm off, you decide amputation is the correct decision because you can replace it with something which functions quite well? Or would it ever get to a point where something functions so well that amputation is the only legally defensible position for a medic to take in an emergency situation, because amputation and replacement with biomechanical augmentation would actually work better than if you just tried to save the limb as it was. So this brings up a bunch of questions which you can quite easily see really having an impact in day-to-day work of people such as medics. And then there are a whole bunch of sort of ethical and sociological, philosophical issues about where do we stop? Where does it stop becoming correction, and where is it enhancement? When do these become voluntary? And yeah, when do, as I said before, these sort of experimental at the moment, either entirely theoretical or experimental procedures, at what point would they become so accepted as to be a duty? So I like going back to this. Anyone who knows a bit of Irish mythology, this is King Nuada of the silver arm. And I think it's a handy sort of illustration of the fact that you can find interesting analogies for this going way back. If anyone knows the story, I'm just going to go through it quickly. King Nuada of the Tuatha De Danann, the people who lived in Ireland before the Gaels, he unfortunately lost his arm in the Battle of Moytura. And under their law, he couldn't be king anymore. So interestingly enough, to a legal mind, that does sound an awful lot like a constitutional law issue or an administrative law issue. He couldn't fulfill his public role because he didn't have his arm. Now, they gave him a silver one, close enough to a biomechanical augmentation. That still wasn't enough. He wasn't considered whole. He couldn't be king. So eventually, he did actually get his arm grown back by the helpful Dean Cecht, and he could be king again. But it is an interesting, again, we move from sci-fi to mythology. I will move on to real-world applications soon, I promise. But it is an interesting idea that it's not entirely new, these sort of problems, to grapple with these sort of problems. So here's the more practical side of it. Is a guy called Neil Harbison, who many of you probably have heard of, who set up the Cyborg Foundation. And I find his work particularly interesting. Well, it's interesting full stop, but particularly interesting from a legal point of view, because he had an awful lot of problems with getting people to actually agree to implant this eyeborg he has. So you can see the antenna here. That allows him to perceive color through sound waves. And that's actually now, it went through several iterations, but is now built straight into the bones in the back of his head. So he hears it through bone conduction. So it is part of him. He cannot remove it. And he has internalized that psychologically, physiologically as a sense. So it's very much part of him, and so it speaks to his position in society, it speaks to the definition of human, the definition of sense. And I find it particularly interesting that he had problems. He went to a number of people trying to get, as you can see here on the right-hand side, trying to get people to agree to do this, and he found it very difficult. He did in the end, but it was under the position of anonymity. And you'll notice that comes up again and again in this area, that medics are either unwilling to do so, they're willing to do so, but their hospital is unwilling to do so, their insurance won't cover it. So often people end up not going to medics to get these sorts of things done. There's also an interesting administrative point of view that he did manage to get a photo with him wearing his device, and that was an earlier version, which I don't think was fully as integrated as it is now. He managed to get a picture of that on his passport. So often says that he's the first officially recognized cyborg by a government. Again, being a stickler for the legal side of it, I would say that he's more been sort of quasi-recognized by a public body, but it's close enough. It's still very significant. This is a lady called Moon Rivas, who's also, she's a collaborator of Harbison's, and she has an implant in her arm which allows her to sense seismic activity around the world. So she deals an awful lot with the sort of the societal implications of this. She's a social cyborg. She can feel things that are going on all around the world, and that's a big part of what the Cyborg Foundation are focusing on. But she also encountered similar issues with medical hurdles, and she performs a dance called Waiting for Earthquakes, where she goes on stage and essentially interprets what she feels through her arm. And if I'm not mistaken, she did this at Republica 2013. It's quite interesting because there's data coming from outside, external data coming in and causing an impact on her body. And that brings up a number of liability issues. But there's also the reverse of that, which you'll see more and more in medicine, is biosensors, which is where you have a sensor inside your body sending data outside. So on the one hand, you've got liability issues when data or feedback comes in, and you've got data protection and a number of other issues when information is going out. So here is a collaboration between Harbison and Rivas, as well as Livio Babitz and Scott Cohen, which is called Cyborg Nest, which is particularly interesting. Again, I used to work in consumer law, because this is one of the few consumer products out there that allow people to enhance themselves. It's called Cyborg Nest. You implant it, generally they suggest, in the middle of your chest, and it allows you to sense north. At all times, you get a little vibration when you're facing north. And the idea is that it'll similarly give people an extra sense. But quite interesting is that they went with barbell piercings, and they specifically say in a number of places that they did this because they don't want people to have to go to a doctor. They want people to be able to get this done by body modifiers because there are still serious issues with medics being involved in this at all. And from both reasons, the people who want it done maybe are reluctant, but also the medics themselves are. So another interesting example of this is that you often find in anything to do with pharmacology or sort of bioediting, biohacking, and as well as mechanical augmentations, you find that early analogies and test cases crop up in sports law, because sports law is an area where obviously these have a practical impact, and also it's very often quasi-legal. It doesn't have to go through the lengthy processes of normal courts. So it's quite interesting to see how the Oscar Pistorius case went, and the various different views that people had on that, as well as people like Julian Savulescu, who've said that certainly from a pharmacological and biological point of view, that the strict limitations on doping perhaps don't make as much sense as technology develops as it does. And there was the Cybathlon in 2016 with the ETH Zurich and the Swiss National Competence Center for Research in Robotics, where they actually had a sort of sports competition, Olympic style, for people with various different augmentations and for pure robotics. So back to the actual medical developments, you'll see something here called the Argos 2, which is essentially a glasses which can perceive visual input, and then they bring that back to the retina, the back of the eye, to allow people to get some modicum of sight back. So this has a number of implications for things such as the legal definition of blind, for traffic law, for exemptions for various different things which you cannot do when you're generally considered legally blind. And there are also, of course, not just on this, but similar technology along these lines. It starts to impact with real law quite a bit, such as in whether or not assaulting someone when you have a prosthetic is considered assault with a deadly weapon, and the likes of that. There have been a number of cases in the US about this. So as I said, I'm really just touching on areas quite quickly. The audience for this kind of talk tends to be quite diverse, so I don't want to go too much into the legal or into the technical, not least because I might not know. So I'm very, very open to people correcting me or giving me a bit of steer on this at the end. But an area I've looked quite a lot at is biohacking and what's called the grinder movement, which is a sort of a DIY approach to these sorts of issues. Because people are noticing that they can't get this isn't entirely done through normal medical avenues, and it's very much a lot of the more interesting developments in this area come from people essentially doing it themselves or from body modifiers. There's also an interesting body called Cyborgs e.V. based in Berlin, who I was talking to before I gave a version of this talk in Berlin one year. And they work with people who have various different levels of augmentations or interest in that. And as I said, they normally go to people like body modifiers to avoid potential issues with liability. So again, as I said earlier, the general approved practice could be quite complicated if eventually this moves into the medical area. So there's a little bit more detail here on the grinder movement. Up here at the top is a guy called Václav Koller, who's, again, from the Deus Ex video game. He's from the one after, the one I discussed at the start. And it's a little bit closer to maybe what a lot of the DIY body modifiers and grinders see themselves as, rather than a purely sort of medical prosthesis basis. And interestingly enough, if you go on, there are various different people who sell things like this, such as Grindhouse Wetware and Dangerous Things and Cyborg Nest, as we mentioned earlier. But on biohack.me forums, people are actually interested in the legal implications of this. They do ask questions about it, but there don't seem to be answers there. Again, a little bit more detail on this. I'm going to sort of skip through a few of these slides because I'm not incredibly good at keeping to time during presentations. But a point I'd like to bring up is whether or not it's actually the doctors that dread electric lawsuits rather than the cyborgs who fear electric lawsuits. Because a lot of this is based around whether or not people are worried that they're going to be sued and whether or not their insurance will cover it. The answers are generally yes and no. And so it's worth asking whether or not there should be more involvement of medics. There have been examples where this hasn't worked very well, such as in hip implants in the UK and Ireland. When there are recalls, when there are things which are unsafe, there's an awful lot of argument in the courts over whether or not it was acceptable for someone to implant something or not. So it's not an ideal solution, but as I said here, pictured, not a doctor. It is questionable as to whether doctors, medics, medical ethics boards should be entirely missing from this discussion, except for in a very narrow band where they have been medically approved. This is a slide which I simply put in so I could have this headline, my breasts burst in the car. But it does actually have quite an important legal implication. This just shows this is essentially bags of silicone and caused huge amounts of litigation. And it was incredibly complicated because it had been certified by TÜV in Germany, in Rhineland, and then people sued them. There's a big question as to who someone should sue in this situation. They sued them, they sued the manufacturers, they sued the company who sold them, they tried to sue some of the people who were involved in implanting them. So this is an incredibly complicated case that was essentially based on faulty silicone being used in breasts, which happened to burst more often than usual. And the question here is, if you add technology to anything, it becomes generally infinitely more complicated. So the potential for having any kind of implants is this plus technology. So you can see why this is going to be potentially quite problematic. Another area which people bring up quite often is the idea of hacking, rather than biohacking, actually hacking smart devices which are implanted in the human body. And there's quite a lot of worry about this. There's some issue as to whether it's a moral panic. On the other hand, some people say there are actual things you should be worried about here. I don't know if anyone follows on Twitter the Internet of Shit, which is a very, very helpful guide. They don't even have to write their own jokes. They simply retweet most of the time things which very enthusiastic private companies have said, this is great, we've added Internet of Things capability to your toilet, to your teddy bear, and there are constantly, every day, data protection issues and issues with things simply not functioning because you don't have an internet connection anymore. So you notice it's not always necessary to have things on the Internet of Things, but if things continue as they currently have, that may well be a feature of an awful lot of augmentations. So moving on to this is essentially just a plug for work I did myself, which isn't entirely relevant, but like a lot of the areas I talk about, it's an analogy for the kind of problems that you could encounter here. So I looked at medical nanoparticles, and again, these are very, very dumb. They're not smart technologies. It's essentially biomechanical. But even there, I found reams of work about how difficult it is to figure out what the liability implications are. Are these medical devices? Is there strict liability? Do you have to actually be negligent to be sued? Does there have to be something negligent in the manufacture or the implementation? Or can you simply be sued because you put these on the market? And at the moment, probably, if things are considered medical devices, they will, under national law, EU law, they'll be considered medical devices, and there'll be quite strict liability for anything that goes wrong with them. On the other hand, if they're not, it may simply be, or if they don't come upon anyone's radar, they may simply be, well, look, you did this yourself, sort it out yourself. So probably there's a happy medium somewhere in between, where there is some sort of liability for the people involved in creating and implanting these things, but maybe strict liability might serve to scare people away a little bit too much. So there's a very interesting project which I'd just like to mention here at the end, which is Everyday Cyborgs, which is the Wellcome Trust has funded Professor Murren Quigley's work on this. And it's very interesting. It's very much in the area that I'm interested in, and deals with a whole host of sort of legal, sociological, philosophical issues about everyday cyborgs. So really, this is not science fiction. This is not necessarily high-end medicine, but this applies to anyone who has any sort of technology in them. And it builds on work, and this is actually where I originally got my interest in this. It's from Jill Haddo, based in Edinburgh, who's worked with patients who've had various different devices, often implantable cardiac defibrillators. I don't know if people have heard of implantable cardiac defibrillators, but they're essentially like the energetic cousin of a pacemaker, and they shock you if you are going into cardiac arrest. And people have described it as like being kicked in the chest by a horse. Obviously, these will fail at times, or people won't know whether they failed or not, or whether they triggered correctly, but being kicked in the chest by a horse randomly obviously has legal implications. You may be driving a car. There are a number of things which can happen. But she's looked at it from the personal sociological point of view, but is also feeding into this work on the everyday cyborgs. So it's both relevant as to the changing societal view as to what is a cyborg, what is a person, where does personhood end, but also those are intimately connected to actual hard, concrete legal questions, such as where does personhood end for the purposes of data protection law, for the purposes of liability. So yeah, just to end with a rather nice quote. I don't actually think this is even on the Cyborg Foundation website anymore, but this is the foundation set up by Harbison and Rivas. to encourage people to extend their senses, extend their sense of personhood through cyborg modifications. But they see, again, if I've been maybe sounding a little bit negative because I'm seeing all of these potential problems, that's unfortunately just what lawyers do. But I'm quite interested in this technology. I see the potential for this. They see the potential for this, not simply as augmenting people's ability, making people better, but expanding the human experience. So I definitely recommend looking up their work, and if people are more interested in the technicalities of it, looking up Quigley and Haddo's work on everyday cyborgs. Anyway, thank you very much, and I'm welcome to any questions you might have in the little bit of time I've left. Thanks.
We in fact have around 7 minutes left, so please give me a sign of hand, and I will come to you with the microphone.
Wow, thanks for that, but it was so much to take in. I was just interested in, is this the kind of thing that should really be being considered for like the GDPR, for example? I mean, because it seems so much of this is right on the border of what's already happening, yet law's not really considering it on these large-scale legal protections.
Thank you.
That's absolutely one of the key areas that this is going to impact. I've worked in the area of data protection before. I've looked into it a little bit. I wouldn't be an expert on it quite as much. Well, I'm not an expert on anything, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't be able to bluff my way through being an expert of it quite as much as maybe in medical liability or something along those lines. But it is interesting. It ties into the more broad problems that people have with the GDPR anyway, or the current data protection regimes in, first of all, at EU level, but secondly, even at national level. People often aren't aware of what the implications are, especially startups, especially in these areas where it's very innovative, it's very new. People are very excited about it, and it does things quite differently, especially it does things quite different with data, with biological data. As I said, you have biosensors, quite sensitive data going out. You also have things where there's feedback in the human body, so data coming in. Again, from a data protection point of view, not quite as relevant, but it shows that it's quite sorry, I, like an idiot, forgot to turn my phone off. Thanks that no one else's went off. But it shows that it's quite core to an awful lot of these developments. And people, no, they don't know. People working in this area often don't know. But again, there's a split between high-end prostheses and things such as insulin pumps made by medical devices companies. They're generally slightly more aware of it. But then there are people doing this in their garages, putting LEDs under their hands. LEDs, fine, but as soon as they start putting personal data and things and use, and a lot of people do that. I was quite tempted to get a chip put in my hand that I could use to open my phone or use to get into work and things like that, which you can buy, I think, from Dangerous Things. I've not been sponsored by them. I'm just quite excited about it. I'm planning to do it at some point. But you do notice, yeah, that this comes up again and again, and it's not very well appreciated at the moment, what the implications are, and I very much doubt that this area, certainly in the DIY grinder biohacker movement, they're not aware, people generally are not aware of how, what the data implications are. So GDPR will throw a bit of a spanner in the works of a lot of these areas.
We'd have time for one more question. Then perhaps just closing, because this is such a wealth of information that you presented in such a short time. Do you have any recommended viewing or reading? Like if you'd say, okay, that was a crazy overview for anybody who's super interested, this is the place where you would start to dig deeper.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, that's very much, I picked a number of areas where problems crop up and said, here's a quick overview of it. If people are interested in any of the various areas, either ask me, I'll point you towards things, or more broadly, I would say for the legal and also a lot of the social and ethical implications, the Everyday Cyborgs work now at the moment, there's not been a great deal published on that. I think the project only started early this year or late last year, but the Everyday Cyborgs Wellcome Trust initiative, a lot of the work done by Jill Haddo as well looks at how this impacts actual people, how this impacts patients, especially for medical devices. There's also there's a wealth of information on a sort of a non-official side by looking at things such as going towards the grinder movement. So some of I'm guessing that this presentation will be available if people want it. I'm happy for people to have access to this presentation. And essentially the companies and the organizations I've referenced here, they're a good place to start. And you'll see quite a different view, people like Dangerous Things are saying, look, we have no liability for any of this, but here's a bunch of things you can insert into your body yourself. Again, there's a legal question there. They say they have no liability, they probably do. And on the other hand, you have things like Cyborg Foundation, and they have similar legal issues, but Cyborg Foundation is definitely a good starting point for anyone who's interested in this, especially for anyone who's interested in the societal implications, the idea of extending senses, of extending the human experience. But yeah, off the top of my head, they're the main ones I would think of, the Everyday Cyborgs and the Cyborg Foundation and some of the grinder movement stuff. But if anyone has any questions, ask me afterwards.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You're going to be around with us for a couple more hours today?
I think so. I should be around for the rest of
Wonderful.
today.
Okay, thank you. Let's give you another big round of applause, please.
Cheers.